being able to trust birth when you've seen all these babies, be born. You trust yourself that you can do that too. But if you've never seen it before, if you've never seen death before, and that this is the real encouragement, I think, to lean in, to be part of it. Like, I feel like it's not a job to be a doula or a midwife. In some ways, it's our responsibility as women to be part of other people's births, so that when we arrive at that threshold, that we know something about it.
Welcome to the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. The podcast is dedicated to conscious souls looking to change the world. Astrologer by day, climate activist by night. Here is your host, Debra Silverman.
Welcome to the Debra Silverman I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. That's the name of it. This is not true of this beautiful woman you're about to be get acquainted with. This is Siobhan. Say your name.
It's Siobhan Asgharzadeh.
Say your last name again.
Asgharzadeh.
And where is that from?
It's Persian, actually. My dad is from Iran.
I love that it's Persian. Okay, Siobhan is a grief doula, certified birth and death midwife, ceremonialist, and storyteller who lives outside Boulder, where I met her in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Her work is centered around weaving soulfulness into the various passages we move through in our lives, which someone needs to do it through story, ritual, dance, sounding practices, dreams, and wilderness sojourns. She supports people in imagining new ways of engaging with life's many thresholds. In the last many years, she's been focusing on supporting people through the initiation that presents itself when humans are confronted with loss and brought into the depths of grief. It's so beautiful. And she facilitates grief pilgrimages and retreats where she lives in the foothills. So we met in a women's circle where we were all singing at my best friend's home, and I was sitting next to her, and instantly I was like, okay, that's it, you're on my podcast. I really kind of impulsively jumped on her. I was like, you do that? And she was like, okay, because just the entrance of the conversation, which is two of the most important topics in the world, death and birth. I don't know if there's anything else that's more important, and grief. And so this podcast has a range of topics from a real focus on the climate crisis. And there's a lot of scientists speaking. And then there's also these individuals like yourself who are facilitating our ability to deal with hard topics that typically we shy away from, or like we try to avoid and we try to walk away from. And you clearly walk straight into them, which is not a surprise, having looked at your chart and seeing that you have a very, very stable capacity as a 4 planets in Taurus. And I'm going to share your chart if that's okay with you. But what stands out in your chart that really gives you permission is Mars. The planet Mars was on your sun when you were born. So you have a Martian-like energy, a warrior-esque energy that is fearless to confront. Like, even though it's in Taurus, which is super gentle, your Mars energy it only happens once a year, where Mars and the sun are exactly together. So your ego structure and your male energy came together, and you were like, I'm solid. I can handle anything. I'm a tree. So can you feel that part?
Yeah. I mean, I feel the part where I'm able to look under the culture, what people don't want to look at. Like, it feels really, in fact, it feels interesting and curious to me. Like, I want to see it. I want to understand why people don't want to look at it. I want to deepen into that territory. And, not only do I feel solid there, like, I feel honored to be there usually. It feels generative.
Right. So let me just for a moment share your chart. You see here that we're in the 11th house of the futurist, which is part of what fascinated me about you, that all of these planets, these 4, we don't count Chiron as not a planet. So Mars, Sun, Mercury, Venus, all being in Taurus, in the house of the futurist, and your moon being in Aquarius, you're bringing us a new point of view. But what's so interesting, it's old, because Taurus loves old things. So you're bringing us back to an old principled ground. but in the name of the future, because you're Gemini rising, you're double air, you're an articulator, you're a communicator, you have an excessive amount of air, you have 4 planets in air. So talking, you've got a grand trine in air, if you include the ascendant, talking about it is your specialty. But I just want to acknowledge that this conversation today is going to be about how old principles that were left behind bring us into the future. And where it really starts, I just want to entrance here because it's so funny that my son is home after he's Saturn Return, but I gave birth at home without ever having gone to a doctor. Now, I don't tell people this because it was so disturbing to people that I trusted. And then the person, our mutual friend, I was at her 3rd child's birth where she insisted to not have a midwife. And everyone was up in arms. Like, what do you mean? And her answer was, the midwife always takes over. That's so Ashley. So I'd love to have you review, first of all, your training in the natural childbirth principles that allowed women to be empowered. And this conversation for me is the most intrinsic, and I don't talk about it much because I've always hit so much resistance.
Yeah.
So can you speak to your training first and then just tell us where you are now with your practice?
Yeah, so my midwifery training was with the matrona, was this very mercurial midwife named Wapio. Her name is Diana Bartlett, I think, but she calls herself Wapio. And she practiced in the South, in a place where there was actually a lot of availability for these underground midwives to practice, and there wasn't a lot of protocols and laws. But she's really developed this curriculum around trusting women, trusting bodies, trusting birth, trusting babies, and also trusting death, which is, I think, a part of it. And so there is a real encouragement for women to empower themselves in, even if there's a midwife there, that they're the ones birthing their babies, that they're the ones with those innate somatic wisdoms to be able to tune in to what is happening, to access, the liminal states and to be able to birth their babies, so even the practice of being there as a midwife is less about doing anything and more about being the sacred witness, and being a companion there. And she always would say, the best midwife is the one that's like knitting in the corner, So she had a very different and very pioneer, I would say. It's old, but it's new, like you were talking about in the beginning, a very pioneer way of seeing birth. Like right now, I call midwives because a lot of times, like, it's very constructed around the medical world, even midwifery, like the mind. And honestly, like, many moms want that. Many moms want a coach, someone to tell them what to do. And that we're in this kind of new time. And so but there are some moms that really, like you and Ashley, that actually want something different. And they understand birth as an initiation, and they understand birth as this transformative possibility, and that they need to actually go deep in themselves to be able to, like, pull up the wisdom to be able to bring this one through. And so, so for those ones.
Talk about the opposite, because all the women, and I don't tell people, honestly, I am very reluctant to share with them that I did a home birth in the water and that I really didn't see a doctor for the whole time, because they get terrified. So can you speak to that? Because honestly, the millennial women that I have had the opportunity to be an elder for, when I hear them talk, their first answer is, I do it naturally, but I want to be in the hospital.
Yeah.
So did you meet that? Do you hear that often?
I mean, in some ways, that's why I began to move towards death, because I feel like a big part of that kind of
mindset
way of holding birth comes from the fear of dying, the fear of babies dying or moms dying, and that it's really, the work that I do is really going back into the old understandings of initiation, because you do meet death at birth. that is true. Every mom will meet death at birth. They don't necessarily meet their physical death, but they might actually. Like that happens.
And they also
sometimes.
meet the end of an era. You will never be
Yes,
an
you'll never be the
independent.
same.
The minute that baby comes out of your tummy, you're done.
Totally. And even with the second and the third, it's like every baby, something dies and you become a new being to be able to parent this new one. And so I feel like a lot of what we're looking at in the birth world is that fear. And what's unfortunate is moms that are usually approaching that threshold haven't had initiation of rituals, or have met that kind of understanding, that meeting that, like the value of pain and challenge and hardship, and really understanding that, though, like leaning into those experiences is what actually gives us the tools and the wisdom to be able to parent the child, actually, in some ways, to become the new person that we're going to become.
So did you change towards death? Did you leave behind
I still work in the birth world, but I'm more focused on death and grief, right? Because part of what I feel birth really brought me into that conversation and a real deep look at what was happening there. And I feel like I would have been an incredible midwife like 200 years ago, when there was more of a trust of birth and bodies and women and babies. And but
I would have been really good 200 years ago.
I would have fit right into that role.
Every Taurus. I'm born in the wrong era. How did I get stuck in this modern day life? So tell us what you do now with death. Is it actually being in the room with someone or dealing with the grief after?
Well, I will say that in this moment, so I started studying death midwifery and sitting at that threshold with people, and volunteering at hospice was where I was working, actually, and I was still doing the birth work as well, and like being there in the death world, you really see how we hold death as a culture, and the real avoidance of looking at death. I mean, the disappearance of the bodies it's almost like we don't believe in death. That's Stephen Jenkinson, who is a death activist. He says that this culture doesn't believe in death, which is a very interesting thing to consider there at the end when you're looking at the end of life. Like, there's so much strangeness when you do look, like when you lean into like, whoa, like even yesterday, a friend of mine just shared with me that her son just overdosed on fentanyl, and which is huge, to lose your child, right? And they're in that experience, and this is for all moms who experience the death of their child in an overdose situation, that it's just like the body is taken to do autopsy, and they have no access to the body for up to 2 weeks. There's no availability to be in. So this is a mom that actually wants to lean in and to sing to her son, to the soul of her son that's crossing over, to be able to be there. And our, way of dealing with that is just so about, well, just in case there was any foul play, or just in case we need to do all of these autopsies. So it's science, over this heartfulness or humanity, and it just feels like such a disservice to the grief process, right? So when you start really looking at how we navigate death in this culture, then you start asking, or what I started asking was why. And what I feel is that, one, we don't know how to grieve. We don't know how to be in the grief process. We don't know how to go through that dark night to reemerge. And that's really about initiation. And so what I started getting really curious about is how we can work with grief, reimagine grief as an opportunity to initiate ourselves and to meet the depths of our being, so that we can come forward understanding something about life, understanding something about, how to.
It's wisdom. It's like there's these two entities called birth and death that are these very ominous, almost like superheroes that look like they're evil. Such a crazy thing. Instead of being these two superheroes that give you the gift of wisdom, they're carrying in their back pocket the doorway to initiation that gives us the gift to stand face to face with life. But the very thing we're supposed to learn from, we leave in the back room and we try to avoid them because we're scared. And this is what because I also got trained as a doula for death with two rabbis. For 2 years, I sat with this group, and I one point I asked the room, we were studying together, and I said, raise your hand if you're scared of death. And half the room raised their hand. And I said, raise your hand if you welcome death. And the other half, I was like, this is so classical. You're training to do this, but you're scared of it. Half of you are drawn to it, which is clearly you and I being drawn to sitting in the presence of that very ominous energy, which creates absolute timelessness. Because as soon as you're in a birth, which I've been in many, or been in the room during death, which I've had the privilege, everything gets pale. There's nothing else to do. You're face to face with the ominous. I love the image of this superhero that you're on your knees going, please let me listen. Or you run out of the room as fast as you can.
Yeah. Or try to protect yourself from the discomfort of the unknown, the discomfort of the mystery. And it is uncomfortable because it is the altered state. It's the non-ordinary. If you've been at birth and death and you understand, like, you're actually walking into something different. Like my midwifery teacher, she would call it the veil. Like whether you're birthing or not, if you walk into that field, you are in non-ordinary reality. And
it's my favorite thing. God.
Yeah, I know. It's my favorite place to be.
And I want to just now transfer this conversation, which is why I introduced it, to the climate crisis, because we are in a death. And it's been straight up. Lynn Twist, in Choosing Earth, a wonderful documentary, looked straight into the camera and said, we are now in hospice. And it's like, wait, what? And she said, there's two choices. There's a conscious death or an unconscious death. You can walk into which is what you do. You facilitate as a Gemini Aquarius, your alertness, your ability to stand face to face with all that Taurus heaviness without being scared. But for many people, a conscious death is not even. So the best example, which has never left me, is my best friend who passed 8 years ago. I can't believe it. She had gotten down to 60 pounds. She had emphysema. She was smoking cigarettes with the oxygen tank right next to her. Her sister flew in her best friend, who was a doctor, into Hawaii. She came into the house. She was there for 1 day. And she sat with my friend and she looked at her so skinny, like obviously a stick. And the doctor said to her, we can put something in your stomach with the tube that will feed Ensure into your system and give you some nutrition. And my friend said, I'm open to that. So I'm watching their whole conversation. And then as she left the house to go drive back to the airport, and I said to her, excuse me, how long does my friend have to live? And she said, about 3 weeks. And I said, you never told her. And she said, why would I tell her that? I'm here to give her hope. I was like, wait, because I became the mean one who could not, like I said, Judy, we've got to get a plan. And everyone said, Debra, stop telling. So that was when I realized, whoa, we're going to walk over death as though it's not in the room.
Right.
And that was the turning point for me to go, this is just like the birthing people that go straight to the hospital. And I don't judge them because they're terrified to stay home to give birth. And they want someone to tell them what to do because they don't feel the empowered, what Ashley feels. You look at Ashley, you're like, that's empowered. But so I wanted to do this podcast desperately because I want to stop and ask all of you listening, what's your relationship with death? It's a heavy question. And if there is the wisdom keeper in behind that curtain, behind the veil, who has this incredible richness in the name of consciousness, there's nothing richer than standing face to face with truth to me.
Yeah.
Now, I am also Gemini, so I have the fascination with all things. Like I will not walk away from anything. So I'm curious, in your practice, the resistance to death and birth seems to be universal. Is that your experience?
I mean, in this culture, most definitely. And I feel like the thing that is, I want to say there is that there's something about, it's like the beauty that is possible, like death as your final gift to life, really. And even like if you gift your death to life in this very beautiful way, you know, like if you do it, we can say consciously, but really soulfully, like where you're really bringing in like all of the songs and the rituals and reimagining what that can be, then you gift that to your community. And then your community gets to witness this, like this receive, not even witness, receive this gift of your death. And then the grieving process is really different, you know, like when there is, it's still there, but there's not the trauma of this kind of disappearing body that like just we're avoiding it. So you're taking out that piece, you know, and then there's like a beauty. And so it's going to be a slow repatterning, you know, of that possibility that lives there, making it beautiful.
That's your function. Do you know that Ashley's father-in-law, I just witnessed his death. So this was the most profound, to your point. He gave all of us a gift. He raised the bar for me. I will never look at death the same. Yeah. This was just within the last month. I walked into his room. It was machines everywhere. He had the oxygen on. He was clearly at the end of his life. His family was all there. And I came in and he was like, oh, Debra. And I was like, all he did was smile. And I said, George, what drug are they giving you? Because this does not look right. Like, why? He was like, I'm so happy to see you. And he just kept looking around the room, smiling. And then, to your point, Ashley and her husband sang the last day of his life for 5 hours in a room where the nurses were walking by going, what is happening in there? And then as he left, his son reviewed his life with him and he went out with a smile. And that grieving process, to your point, has become exquisite because every time I think of this man, I think of the beauty that he left this world. And I mean, to this minute, I'm so awed. I'm more in love with, I was in love with him anyways, but the wisdom that he left with, I've never witnessed anything like it. So to your point, that is contagious. It raised the bar for me. All of us in his community were touched deeply. And now I know that the grief doesn't have to be that his body leaves. We all pretend, no one talks about it. We're all in disgust. We can't believe that, instead of being.
Yeah, I really do feel that, like when there is these, you know, these, Stephen Jenkins says, die well, like when there's a well death, like there's wellness around a death, you almost feel like it hits the earth and goes boom, like this gift, it just like feeds. And we see that in nature too, right? You know, like when a tree falls, it like feeds the earth. Like there's ways that we understand that the compost, you know, like what is decomposing, there's like a way that death feeds life. And so it's old wisdom that we've forgotten, you know, with like the human death.
And have you seen beautiful deaths? Have you been privy to having that experience? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen such beautiful deaths, and I've seen also deaths. I think I'll just speak to the first death that I was a part of, and I wasn't there for it because it was my best friend, and it was very sudden. She was 33 and she died of a pulmonary embolism when she was 3 months pregnant, actually, with her second child. There was this, and I wasn't in the state, and I was just beginning to transition from birth work into death work, and this is what actually just brought me right in, because when I went there, I really could see so up close how no one wanted to lean in. No one wanted to be there, including her husband. And I had to really advocate for the 4-year-old, the little boy, to be able to see her body, you know, because they didn't want the child to have that memory. And I had to encourage them that it wasn't, that if he didn't see the body, it would just be a disappearance. It would be like, what happened to mom? It was like, there's something, 4-year-olds, especially like that age, you really want to understand what's happening and to see the body and like, okay, there's not life here anymore. Like she's gone, she's not in the body. And then where is she? That gets to be, but so what happened there for that that death is like, I had to really advocate for tending to the body. So we went in there and we washed her body and thanked her body, just to be with the body in this way of like, thank you, these hands that like touched my face and, you know, and held my hand, and these lips that kissed my lips, you know, like we had that kind of friendship. We were the friends that would like cuddle with each other, you know, and just, we loved each other so much. And so to just thank her beautiful vessel, this beautiful body, for the celebration of being able to inhabit it and to touch me, you know, like there's something about matter, the actual body. And so we got to wash her body, we blessed it with oils, we dressed her, and she was very devoted to Ayurveda, and so we dressed her in her most beautiful Indian sari and gown, and we put flowers and all these beautiful sticks with lichen all around her, you know. And this was because at this point, and I didn't have any control of this, but it was in a mortuary, you know, which is, you know, not the place that this would usually happen. Like, I am definitely an advocate of home funerals, but it was in the mortuary, and we got to get her son to come in. Finally, the father decided that it was a good idea and brought her a gift, and so it was just this really beautiful celebration that we got to sing to her body. And you know, we didn't have that much time, you know, which is the unfortunate part. And then I had a 4-day fire in a kiva for her, where the community just came and prayed, because we couldn't be with her body because of the way that it was set up. With the husband wanted it that way. But we got to be in there and really pray and sing and grieve together and be in it. And then no one wanted to go to the crematory. They wanted her to be cremated. So I went with my sister, and we did ceremony there too, to like give her body to the fire. So it's not about what happens. Like, this is something that my midwifery teacher always said, it's how we bring the sacred into those experiences. Like, you can have a cesarean and have it be sacred and have it be holy. It's like, how do you make this have meaning with whatever it is that is the choice? Like, how do you weave ritual and song? And we sang her into the fire, and I got to speak to the fire that was going to be taking her and make offerings to the fire and push her in with that tears and song and pray. And I remember there was this little man that was standing there. He works at the crematory. I like loved, he was like a little man that had these bright eyes and a big nose. And I was like, he is totally from a different world. And he's the one that pushes these bodies into the fire. You know, like when you start leaning in, you start seeing the death keepers, that there are some out there. So I just share that one. That was like my first real experience with leaning in to death. And I think that that's the piece, is that there's just like, when you lean in, there is so much richness in that world.
It's as though we want to avoid the initiations and the transitions that matter the most. It's just the most peculiar thing. It's the same thing about giving birth. Your body is complete. I kept thinking while I was giving birth, there's been 7.8 billion people that have done this before, and we got this. Like, instead of assuming position, I kept thinking of the little Chinese women with small little hips. I was like, this is literally what I was thinking. They can do it, I can do it. And I would talk myself through it. And it was a home birth in the water. Not unlike this death you're describing, where it was in the fire. So there are these elemental pieces that occur in the name of birth and death. And my life's work is the elements. So I'm always giving people permission to sanctify, to see the holiness, which is what I hear you speaking to. Lean into the holy land of this reality is so magnificent, because you get to be scared out of your mind and walk right in. You get to be sad out of your mind and cry so hard. There's you just turn the volume up, guys. But there's something to be said about the human dilemma of minimizing, avoiding, distracting, negating, like we have this built-in system. It's like a shield goes down. I hear women say to me, I would never give birth at home with a woman who didn't have the training of the medical world. What are you, crazy?
Right.
Well, how many 100, 200 years ago, how many millions of years have women given birth in the field?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the way that we've medicalized birth is really strange.
To have the woman lift up her legs. It's a gravity experience. And we're going to lean you back.
Totally. Yeah, that came from some like king too in England that wanted to just see it. You know, it's some strange thing. I mean, the way that it's all happened is odd. To say the least. And for me, I'm actually opposite. It's like so strange to go to the hospital.
Me too. Yeah. Even going to the doctor. I mean, I kept saying they're going to go to the doctor and they're going to tell me everything wrong. Right. And I felt so good during my pregnancy. I was like, this was such like, why don't I trust? Yeah. So can you speak to that? Like what gave you, because as 4 planets in Taurus, they typically are very, very cautious. And they come with an inherent trust of nature. Yeah. So is that what gives you the gift of
nature? I mean, it's so natural, right? Birth and death. It's so nature. But I feel like part of what it is for me is let's see. But starting with like community, like since I've been very young, I've been very into building community. I studied eco-village design, and so and went and visited eco-villages, lived in Asheville for a long time where there was a lot of community, did a lot of Native American church, where there was a lot of community. And in that, like you start leaning into what's happening in the community when there is really intact community. So you are involved in birth and you're involved in death because you're involved in a bigger network of what's happening and in different conversations and all of that. I think a big part of what is happening in our world is that moms reach birth and they've never been at a birth before. If you look all around the world, like let's say India, and especially not in modern culture, but in these cultures where there is more intact community, like people have met that threshold, the experience of that with other people in their community before they meet it for themselves. Same with death. Before they meet death, they've most likely experienced many deaths. And I feel like there's something there that is the trust, being able to trust birth. When you've seen all these babies, be born, you trust yourself that you can do that too. But if you've never seen it before, if you've never seen death before, and that this is the real encouragement, I think, to lean in, to be part of it. Like, I feel like it's not a job to be a doula or a midwife. In some ways, it's our responsibility as women to like be part of other people's births, so that when we arrive at that threshold, that we know something about it. And same with death. When we start leaning into being part of death, in just whatever way presents itself, like Ashley and Parker singing at their, father's death, just leaning into that. Now they have a whole different thing that they're carrying in the world, and a whole different offering that they are able to offer to anyone that meets that threshold.
And all of us in their community that saw it, we're like, oh, this is what that is. I didn't realize. Yeah. So to your point, the community element, and say your chart, those 4 planets in the 11th house is the house of community. It's the house of friendship and community and living in a way that's futuristic. That's what's so funny about your chart, the old and the new, because the 11th house is the way of the future. And it is community. Look what happened online. We have an entire cyberspace universe that never existed before. We all go in Zoom rooms, like right now, whoever's watching this, you're part of our community, but it's not touching. It's not tactile. So we've lost the physical, and this is so Taurus. You love to touch, like you love this whole thing, the lips and the face and the skin. But in this world, the transcendent world, we have lost the ability to be with someone who's going through death and know how to, in Judaism, one of my favorite things is about Judaism. There's so many old values they have. It's called sitting shiva. And when someone dies, for a week, in their home, if it's their mother, their child, their spouse, close member, for a week, they take all the cushions off the chairs, they take the mirrors and cover them up. And they say, for this week, you are not to get dressed, you're to stay in your home, but everyone in the community brings over meals. So the door is left open, people come in, and the rule is you cannot talk to the person in grief unless they make eye contact. So you're allowed to live in your house, be in your grief, in your pajamas, uncomfortable, and the neighbor comes in and leaves the things. And if you want to talk, because of course at grief points, we don't need words, then you walk up to them. Otherwise, after that week is over of sitting Shiva and being allowed, you put a torn piece of cloth on your body for a year. It looks like a rip, and you pin it on. And everyone in that community that sees that torn black piece of material knows that if you start to cry, you're allowed to. So it's an acceptable way in a community to know how to value death. And then my favorite part is, which happened in my family, is a year after the person dies, you go back to the cemetery. Everyone goes back a year later and you revisit the pain, but you do it this time by talking about the person when the stinger is out. And once again, you revisit your love for that person. Did you know that those were the rituals?
Beautiful. Yeah, I've heard from I've never participated in that. But in Persian culture, they have very similar tradition, actually, which is beautiful. You know, I love that the Jewish and the Persian are so brothers, you know, but they're, even though they're still warring, but
that is the old version of community where we knew that if someone was pained, we could be there for them. Where now it's a private experience grieving. It's almost like you shouldn't grieve. You shouldn't give birth at home. You shouldn't deal with that. Like, woo. So I was so excited to meet you and to see your chart and go, oh, she has 4 planets in Taurus in the house of the future. She's bringing us these old rituals to set us up because in the future, as the climate crisis, there's going to be death on this planet. We're not going to have the same numbers of people that can survive because we've overdone the population. Yeah. Dare I say it?
What you said, what Lynn Twist said, I've said that very similar thing before, is that we might be in a place where we're midwifing the death of the current reality, you know, and, you know, I don't say the earth because I feel like in some ways, the earth will survive. I mean, humans, we're going to take down a lot of species, which is really sad and painful, but it is that kind of like, okay, if this is the moment that we're in here, then how do we do that beautifully? How do we actually bring ceremony and ritual and a real, like, you know, honoring of the experience we have had and not grasping to hold on to something that is dying, you know, and not trying to, that's the medical way, a medical model, keep it alive, but really like leaning into that could, and not everybody's ready for that. Like that's a huge conversation. But I do feel like it is a beautiful one. And the one thing I just actually presented at a storytelling conference on climate change recently, and which I thought was really powerful to be bringing storytelling into the conversation of climate change. One of the things that I talked about with climate change is that we approach that conversation, even the word, Stephen Herod-Buhner, do you know him? He's a an herbalist that was down in the Gila.
Say his name again?
Stephen Herod-Buhner, and he wrote a book called Earth Grief that just came out actually recently, and it's powerful. One of the things he talks about in that book is how we are in a place of using all of these words that are mind words, like climate change, science. I mean, it's all these very mental words, and it doesn't actually give us access to our heart. You know, like even the word climate change, it doesn't actually really get you into your body to feel what is really happening on planet Earth. And I felt like it's such a powerful renegotiating. It's not like that we don't ever approach the conversation with our mind, but it's just how do we include the rest of us in that conversation, which is our body, our heart, our soul, our spirit. You know, and those are the 5 aspects of psyche and depth psychology. And it's something that I talk about a lot in grief because I feel like we're such a mind-centric culture that we so often will just hit grief even with our mind. How do we fix it, change it, get better? You know, it's a happy-seeking culture, so we're always moving in that direction. But how do we tend to the rest of us that's also having an experience, but we don't even know how to get there? How do we give the mind what it needs? I think that what the mind needs in a grief situation, for example, is like some sort of language or framework so that it can rest and be invited into the unknown, into the soul territory, that the soul is the place of initiation. Like it loves something like grief because it's like, oh yeah, like this is the prima materia that's going to actually create the transformation that's gonna bring somebody down into the depths of their self, where there is harvest, where there's treasure, so that they come back a more a wiser, and I would say bigger human being in the world to be able to move. And then the heart is just that like holy, like raw, naked emotion, and then the body, obviously we've experienced how grief lives in the body with the heaviness and the pain in the heart and the like knot in the stomach, or however it shows up in different ways for different people. And then the spirit perspective is like going to the top of the mountain and being able to see the bigger picture of all of it, and
beautiful. And I always say, I have this funny joke that I made up, that the soul is a slut. Like it loves everything. It has no preferences. It doesn't hear who it sleeps with. So the soul's in love with death. The soul's in love with birth. Like we're going to get to initiate. The goal of this game, said the astrologer, is every soul comes in with this funny, as you just described, the little heart and the little ego and the little mind and the little all this. But at the highest level, every single being here has a soul going, oh, I'm going to learn about what? This is so exciting.
Here we go.
Throw me into the birthing process, throw me. And then the ego goes, what are you talking about? We are not going down that street. That's horrible. And the soul goes, see you later. If I can have my way as a soulful being, I'm going straight to the doula. I think she's the coolest person in town, because nothing does the soul love more than intimate, deep conversation. That my nickname was Debbie Deep when I was young. I've always had, like when I was starting my relationship with writing, Ashley would be in the room, and I was self-conscious about two things. One is that I love death. That death to me, I always knew was the passageway to enter to my soul contracts, so I could find the nature of love. I mean, I've had this like secret affair with death that people in my kids have gotten pissed off with me, like, would you stop talking about? But it is a soulful conversation to say, it's going to happen to everybody. And the planet's evolution is not a surprise. I call it climate crisis. And then it changed to climate consciousness. Like we're learning about timelines and the evolution of this planet. Of course, it's getting hot. Whether or not the planet was going to be affected by carbon, we were headed towards a warming cycle. Duh. But we get caught in, no, don't change. This is so Taurus. Don't change, hold on to it, don't change. And of course, Buddha was a Taurus. He was born under the Taurus sun. And his whole message was all suffering comes from attachment. So when you get attached to, don't go, there's an incredible amount of contraction. And what we're looking at, what I saw sitting next to you that day was, I was like, oh baby, she's got the wild, calm Taurus. I really felt that in you. I was like, interview her. There's nothing more important. There's not a more important conversation to be had than, is your soul consciously agreeing with your chart? Are you in congruence with what you signed up with? And if you're not, then you've got to go consult an astrologer or a counselor or a shaman or a doula and say, I know there's something living in me that's got me feeling, to your point, my heart is heavy, my body's in a knot, I feel like my throat shut down, I've lost my chi. All of that is a depressed soul. Because when the soul walks straight into truth, it's like, why do I feel so good?
Right.
Even in the pain.
Totally. I mean, Clarissa Pinkola Estes is one of the teachers that I've studied with for many years. And she always says that soul is an endangered species in this world right now.
Oh my God, I love this. I never heard that the soul is an endangered species right now.
Yeah. I mean, and the piece that I think that this whole conversation has been about in some ways is exactly that, that how you build soul is by leaning into the various thresholds of life, by going down soul goes down. Michael Meade says soul goes down, spirit goes up. So by going down into the unconscious, into the depths of your being, to see what's there, to look around, to stay awake when you're down there, and to really understand what is yours to pick up and do in the world. And that is what is going to, like with the chart, that is what is going to align you. It's like there is a part of you that actually knows, but it's not here that you're going to find it.
I know. Why does everybody live here? I have to just complete with, yesterday was my birthday, and I had this honor of my son arriving home, and he has gone into that initiation cycle of Saturn Return. So anyone 28 to 30 or 58 to 60, it's a cycle where the initiation really escalates, and they take you out of the free will zone, and they take you out of the, you're not driving anymore, and they drive you off the cliff to see how you're going to cope with change. And I've been so honored to see that he has taken that deep journey underneath the world and come up looking like an entirely different person. And as a mom, and I speak to all the moms out there, I had to take my hands off. I had to back up entirely. I had to let there be a death, saying to myself, you are not, this is a person you rented. He borrowed your oven. He came out. Now you give him back. And it was a very painful for me. And my soul was like, I trust this being more than I trust me. He's so old. And so I gave him the gift of saying, hands off. So the death doesn't just occur in the death, or the birth doesn't occur just in the birth.
No.
There are moments and cycles, as the astrologers know, where there's Saturn returns that come, and the transit is so intense. And that is when trust in the stars, in the soul, in the doulas, in the wisdom keepers is asking you to lean in. So part of this podcast is, as a collective, forget about our own personal lives. We are in an initiation. Will we let this transition be graceful and kind and wise and really rich in its minerals and its nutrition? Or will we shut down in fear and reduce our capacity to actually glean what this cycle is about? No one's going to look back at 2022, 2023, 2024 and not say, whoa. I mean, we didn't see coming what was in 2020.
Right.
That was an initiation, but we have not. And I just did this beautiful video that I produced and I sent out to my audience saying, we've only just begun. The descent is now upon us. So knowing you're around, just the beauty of knowing that you've got this comfort in the land of birth and death and grief, and knowing that my gift is to bring together a community of people to say, you guys, go be present for the death, stay present for the grief. If we can't see it, your point was so well taken. If you've never seen birth, like my final analogy is the earth right now is giving birth. And we, the midwives, are either going to sit in the room and go, or we're going to say, why is she screaming? Why is she yelling? Everything's wrong. Her water's off. Her air's off. The earth, this is exactly what birth looks like. But you didn't see it before. You wouldn't know that, of course, we'll get through this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the both, and it's the, I love that. It's midwifing the death and then also midwifing the birth, because it is that what the birth is going to be. But like where we're at right now is the death. And so it's like being present to both at the same time, which reminds me of a little story. If I can just tell a story. This is a story that I learned from Michael Meade, and maybe you know it, but I think that the listeners might enjoy it. So once upon a time, sitting at the edge of the world in a cave, in a dark cave, there was an old woman, and she was old, not like old like your grandma, but old like a mountain. She had wrinkles that were like canyons, and she was finishing the weaving of this beautiful tapestry, just putting those last strands of porcupine quills right around the edge of this tapestry. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful tapestry she had ever created. There were mountains, there were beautiful songbirds, there was a gorgeous sun, there were butterflies moving. You could see everything moving, the beautiful rivers, the oceans, the colors of all the flowers, the smells, everything in this tapestry was everything that we know as creation. So she remembered, though, before she was quite done, she remembered that there was a pot of dreams stirring in the back that needed to be stirred. So she walked back to the back of the cave and she stirred that pot and she sang over that pot of dreams and seeds. And when she walked back to her tapestry, her little black dog had unwound the entire tapestry, and there sitting in her cave was all of the threads of creation right there in a great big pile. And so she stopped for a moment and she wept. She felt the grief of this beautiful creation that she had created. She felt the grief, and who knows how long she stood there in that grief. But from that grief was born an idea. She saw a golden thread there laying in the pile, and she had an idea for a new creation. And so she picked up that thread and she began weaving again. And they say that if she were to have finished that tapestry, it would have all been over. So give thanks for the little black dog.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Good storyteller, Gemini, rising moon in Aquarius, double air. God, you got me. We must be willing to see that there is not our minds required to understand the cycles, that it's too big for our mind to understand. And if we stay humble and on our knees and trust everything, life will continue. Unconquerable life prevails. It will never stop.
Mm-hmm.
Look at me.
Yeah, that's what I love about the stories. You know, it just brings you right in to the feeling body. And
that's how we get out of our mind. That little dog. Thank you, little dog. So you never know. Let us all reduce the mind and drop into our hearts and our souls and live there. And from that place, we become the healing agents and the elders. I'm 65,000 years old. We become the elders that represent how to take our children and their children with us to say, trust. I think I drove my poor mother crazy at the end of her life. She said to me, if you say trust one more time, Debbie, she got so mad at me. I've always lived with deep, deep trust. I always have known that the mountains and the trees and the rocks and the water and the elements will never leave us. They're eternal on this plane of existence. Look at these beautiful flowers. And they will pass and they'll be gone.
They're good teachers of that.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. That was such a beautiful, as I expected, my intuition sitting next to you. I was like, yeah. Did I say it within 3 minutes of meeting you?
Yeah, I know.
Did it feel a little impulsive?
And I didn't even understand that it was a podcast.
I know. I was
just like, I'll have an interview with you. That's my impulsiveness too. Yeah, sure.
Gemini meets Gemini. Well, thank you so much. It was exactly 1 hour. I'm so honored. I'm touched, and the audience will be touched. And this is the essence of this podcast, the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. It's all about saying to people, please have faith.
Yeah.
Lean in to your soul. Trust there are elders and wisdom keepers like you've met today. And you too are one waiting in the wings.
Thank you so much for listening. We want to keep this conversation going with you, so please subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review to make sure you never miss an episode. Remember, climate activist by day, human by night. Send Debra a DM on Instagram at Debra Silverman Astrology and visit DebraSilvermanAstrology.com. And we're going to leave you like we leave every single episode. Make it your mission to change the world.